How's it going, everyone? Welcome to the first inaugural episode of American Memoirs. I'm your host, Bo Gersnich, the dude cuckoo enough to spend 2 years reading all of the U.S. presidential memoirs, and now I'm here to share some of the interesting stories and perspectives from my studies. I hope you enjoy it. For today's episode, I'm going to take you all the way back to 1824, to the election that decided the 6th president of the United States. This election was significant for a lot of reasons, and if you are very interested, you could go ahead and Google it and do a couple of the research for yourself, but I'll give a quick highlight recap. This election was really a time of transition for the country. The previous 5 presidents were all founding fathers of the Union, so you're talking about George Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. All of those guys were founding fathers. And this election was really the tip of the hat to the next generation of leaders in America. So we no longer were tapping the people who were signing the Declaration or the Constitution. We were looking for, the next generation of American leaders. So that actually caused a lot of division because people didn't really know who those leaders were. There's a couple different things that play into part on that. That we will go over later, but really it was a time of political division, and a lot of historians will say that this election in 1824 was actually the first one of a true American election. What I mean by that is it basically brought into play, modern politicking. When I talk about modern politicking, I'm talking about vote whipping, backdoor deals like quid pro quo actions. And really just the end of what Monroe would call the era of good feelings. The era of good feelings was basically this whole concept of political cooperation. Back in the Founding Fathers era, people would actually try and work with each other, which is a crazy idea in today's day and age. Almost to the point where, there wasn't even really competition, where Monroe actually, in the previous election to this one, ran totally unopposed, which is one of only 3 times in history that's happened, the other 2 being the elections for George Washington, who nobody wanted to run against. So that kind of is the era of 1824, so people are starting to come to terms with this new America. And with that, we had a lot of candidates. Because of Monroe's election in 1820 and him running unopposed, only having one party. That party was the Democratic Republicans, which sounds kind of just like a little mashup of our current political situation. We had candidates that, rather than being divided based on political ideology, like your stereotypical division of American politics now with Democrats and Republicans, you had basically division based on regionalism. What I mean by regionalism is you had a candidate from the South, a candidate from the Northeast, a candidate from the West states. And so we had 4 people running under the Democratic Republican Party, all just trying to take their own states up to the top. So I'm going to quickly go over the major players of this event. So the first 4 are going to be the 4 candidates that were receiving votes in the election. So number 1, John Quincy Adams, the son of the 2nd U.S. president, current Secretary of State, also did a lot of other cool things. If you ever read his diaries, he's kind of a right place, right time kind of guy. He was minister to Russia when Napoleon was sacking Moscow and was there for the 100-day return in Paris of Napoleon. Andrew Jackson, who at the time was really not a politician, more of just a really popular war hero, which is a theme you'll see throughout American history, is war heroes having good political odds in the future. So Andrew Jackson, again at the time, really was an outsider candidate, rode widespread fame into prominence. Those were our 2 major players in the election. But the other 2 players who did receive votes, Henry Clay, who was the current Speaker of the House, probably the person with the strongest political acumen, And a lot of historians today will regard him as one of the most powerful men in U.S. Politicians' history because of his strong influence on U.S. politics, basically for decades. He was a major player. And then the fourth person, William Crawford, he was the Secretary of Treasury at the time, and he actually served under the last two presidents. So he, because of that experience and his connections, ended up getting the favorhood of both the late presidents Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Important to note about him at the time, within the last year or so, he had actually suffered a stroke, though, and so his candidacy was often mirrored in controversy due to just concerns about his health. And then there was two minor players. Number one, Martin Van Buren, who's going to be the future 8th President of the United States, who's just getting started on a political course that would have him be a major part in the next couple decades. And then the last major player is going to be General Van Rensselaer, who I'm going to go ahead and refer to as General Van Rennie for the rest of this episode, just because his name's so hard to pronounce. But he's actually a top 10 richest American in history. So think about Ford, Gates, Musk, all those guys who have a ton of money now. This guy's right up there with him. And he's actually also a war hero, same as Andrew Jackson. And serving in the House. So with political experience, he's from New York. He's a friend of Martin Van Buren, who's going to play a big portion of this story. They're friends because they're mutual Dutch heritage, as well as being from the same home state. Important to note about General Van Rennie is he's brother-in-law through his first wife with Alexander Hamilton, which if you've seen the play Hamilton, he doesn't really like the Adams that much. So General Van Rennie has a distaste for John Quincy Adams and his father and the whole clan. So gonna throw it back into the story itself. The original election takes place from October to December 1824. Again, this is our first toss-up election, really, where we didn't have any major candidate come to the front where everyone was like, oh, that's our candidate, that's our guy, we really want him. So we ended up with a very split vote. Andrew Jackson won 11 states, which was 41% of the vote. John Quincy Adams won 7 states with 31%. Crawford won 3 states with 11% of the popular vote, and then Clay won 3 states with 13% of the popular vote. If you're counting back home, that means at this time in 1824, we had 24 total states. So with Andrew Jackson winning the most votes, but not a plurality, which basically means he didn't reach 50%, both of the electors, the states, as well as the popular vote. According to the 12th Amendment, which was pretty new at that time, a very recent amendment to the Constitution, the election was going to go to the House. So the House, according to the 12th Amendment, could only take the top 3 candidates. So who are the top 3? Well, Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams with 11 and 7 states each were obviously number 1 and 2. But Crawford and Clay, who had both 3 states each, kind of were a little bit of a toss-up. The important thing to note with the election and that whole concept of regionalism is Crawford was the candidate for a lot of the South. So Crawford's 3 states that he won were Virginia, Georgia, Delaware. Virginia and Georgia were very big slave states due to that 3/5 compromise, which counted slaves as a portion of the population. Despite Henry Clay having more political votes, or more popular votes, than Crawford, he actually had more electoral votes just because of representation of Virginia and Georgia. So Crawford ended up the third man in for the election in the House due to the fact that they went 41-37 in the electoral votes. So what that means is this left Henry Clay on the out. So Henry Clay, conveniently enough, is the Speaker of the House at the time, which is where this election is going to. So Henry Clay, though he loses the election, becomes the essentially the most powerful person in its decision via both his ability to whip votes just being the Speaker of the House and controlling the singular party there, but also because he's got 3 states behind him that have voted for him and effectively can do his bidding. So every single candidate who's still left, so we've got Jackson, Adams, and Crawford, every single party is immediately thinking, how do we get Henry Clay into our party? So Henry Clay is kind of like the man to want going up to this election in the House. So you think that it would probably spend a lot of time of courting and times for people to come in and try and convince Henry Clay. But surprisingly, Clay declares pretty early that he's going to side with John Quincy Adams. Important thing to know about Henry Clay at the time is his ambition did not change. He was still looking to be president of the United States. Henry Clay, actually, that ambition would drive him 4 more times to run for president of the United States over the course of the next couple decades, with 3 total failed general elections and 2 nominations of his party being failed. So 5 total times Henry Clay runs for president unsuccessfully, which kind of gives you a little bit of an understanding, like, this guy really wanted to be president and was going to do everything that it took to put himself in the best position possible. So arguably, this is a little bit of a gray area in history that you can read a little bit about in John Quincy Adams' diaries. There's a lot of online material too. But there's a couple meetings between John Quincy Adams and Clay at the time, as well as their 2 parties. And John Quincy Adams is the current Secretary of State. And knowing that 3 of the previous 5 presidents, so a majority of the last couple presidents, have all come from a former role of Secretary of State. So Clay makes his intentions known that out of this election, what he wants to do is be the next man up. So how do you be the next man up? You be the Secretary of State. John Quincy Adams, in his diaries, basically acknowledges the fact that those conversations occurs, and acknowledges that he knew that was Clay's intentions, but does not acknowledge that he promised it or that there was any type of deal between them. So if you take John Quincy Adams' word for gold, what that basically means is Clay was operating with an assumption, but not a security, that he was going to be a part of John Quincy Adams' cabinet. On top of that, Clay, politically, he was still concerned politically, and he agreed most with John Quincy Adams and his policies, and he really did not think that either of the last 2 candidates were going to be good presidents. He thought that killing a bunch of British people in the Battle of New Orleans did not qualify Jackson to be president of the United States. He thought you needed a parliamentarian, someone with political experience, political acumen, and that wasn't Jackson. And then he was really concerned about Crawford's physical capabilities to get the job done. Again, he had that stroke recently, and it was a lot of questioning whether Crawford was going to be able to do the job. So with the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, officially declaring his allegiance to the John Quincy Adams camp, that causes a lot of changes in the election between the first part of the election, which was the general popular votes, and then the vote in the House. So just to recap a couple of those changes, North Carolina, the whole state, flips from Jackson to Crawford. The Illinois and Maryland delegations, who at the time had a plurality for Jackson, both flipped to John Quincy Adams. The reasoning being they had both district-based voting, which meant that basically all of their delegates were kind of convoluted in the way that people would end up winning the elections. The popular vote, however, was won by John Quincy Adams in both of those elections, and so they were like, all right, we'll just move on over. They were ready to, abide by the popular vote, and they moved to John Quincy Adams. Last one to note is Louisiana, who at the time split for Jackson. moved back to Adams. Louisiana didn't have any popular vote at all, which was kind of common in these elections of that day, is people didn't even really vote. It was more of the representatives who voted for them. They just flipped. And there's not really a strong reasoning behind, so it's probably the doings of Henry Clay or something of the sort, where a lot of the electioneering and political maneuvering was occurring, where going into this vote in the House, the states had totally flipped. So now, rather than Jackson being in the lead, Jackson was down to 7 states going into the House. John Quincy Adams was up to 13, and then Crawford had bumped one up to 4. Important thing to note is 13 is the magic number for this election in the House, which means effectively John Quincy Adams, if everything shook out like it should, he should win, despite Jackson having more states in the general election and more in the popular vote. The problem was Henry Clay did not have full power of the House or full power of D.C., and there was a rise of prominence of a political, polar opposite of him in the form of the 8th president of the United States, Martin Van Buren. Van Buren, who was from New York, was able to basically come in and convince about half of the New York delegation, which, by the way, had voted originally 26 people for Adams, 5 for Crawford, 4 for Clay, and 1 for Jackson, that they should all move to the Crawford camp. So what his intentions were with that was that New York would become an abstaining vote due to the tie, and they would produce a tie in the House vote, which meant Jackson would have 7, John Quincy Adams would get bumped down to 12, which was not the majority he needed, Crawford 4, and then abstaining from New York, you'd have 1. In his memoirs, Martin Van Buren surmised that after that first vote failed due to New York's delegation being unfaithful, moving over to Crawford, despite their previous allegiance to Adams, as well as the regionalism, by the way. Adams is a northeastern guy, and by all means, New York should have followed him. But because Martin Van Buren was, playing the games with Henry Clay, they would put the vote in the House to a second vote. So that second vote, Martin Van Buren surmised one of that Maryland delegate would flip again. If you remember, Maryland originally went for Jackson, and the first vote was going to go for Adams. Van Buren's basically guaranteeing that one of their delegates would flip back to Jackson, and then John Quincy Adams would fall to 2 states short of the needed 13. His goal past that is that after John Quincy Adams gets bumped down to 11 states, which is 2 lower than he needed, then basically all of the workings that Clay had done to try and position John Adams and position himself in positions of power would basically fall apart, and all of the reps at the time would recalculate, and they would feel more obliged to abide by the wishes of the popular vote at the time, which 41% still wanted to elect Jackson. So that was Martin Van Buren's goal, and he was very, very close to it too. He, according to his whipping, had the amount of votes needed. But the votes, as all things with humans do, that people needed to abide by their word. And that's kind of where the gray area comes into play here. So the Clay camp, who's trying to keep everything together on their end, knows that there's a weak link in the New York delegation. So that New York delegation, one of the individuals in there is our good old pal, General Van Rennie, who was historically known as being fickle, and he was the most fickle of the group. And so Clay was putting considerable pressure on him to switch. I won't go in and quote it because my fiance thinks that it's a little bit too boring to read the autobiographies of Martin Van Buren. But But it's really interesting if you wanted to read. It's around like 150. The election at the time, that day, basically General Van Rennie's going back and forth between Van Buren and the Clay camp. He starts with Van Buren. He confirms. He tells him, I'm not gonna vote for Adams. He doesn't even like Adams as a person. Remember, because his brother-in-law is Alexander Hamilton. So he's basically known for many years he does not like Adams. But Clay, and his buddy Daniel Webster meet with General Van Rennie right before the election in the House, and they really cook up a crazy story, how the political implications, the whole fall of the Union, doomsday kind of thing, if this election is not decided. And that really, really upsets General Van Rennie. But he leaves the meeting and he tells the New York camp that's trying to basically push for Crawford that it doesn't matter what Henry Clay told him. It is irrelevant because he's going to stick to his word. And he's going to vote for Crawford, and the election is going to go as Martin Van Buren wants it to. So he's sitting there in the House, and he is very physically disturbed. So Van Buren recounts that he's watching this guy, and he's very disturbed, and you can tell that there's just a lot on his mind. But at the time, they're passing around the box that's collecting the votes, and General Van Rennie, as he was known to do at the time, he bows his head and basically prays to God, prays to his maker, and he's like, what am I supposed to do? He's seeking guidance. He's unsure whether he should vote for Adams or Crawford. And in this moment, as he's requesting this assistance for God, and he's got his head down and he's looking on the ground, he opens his eyes. And as he opens his eyes, he sees a vote on the ground. And that vote has John Quincy Adams' name already written on it. So General Van Rennie takes that vote off of the ground, picks it up, and again, it's got John Quincy Adams' name on it. He takes it as a sign from God, that God wants him at that moment to vote for John Quincy Adams. So what does he do? When the box gets to him, that vote goes in it as General Van Rennie's vote. When the votes are counted, the New York delegation ends up going for Adams by one singular vote, which was General Van Rennie's. That meant that the New York delegation stayed put. John Quincy Adams had 13 states, ends up being elected the 6th President of the United States. So, crazy time. In the political aftermath of that, Henry Clay does in fact get the role of Secretary of State. So John Quincy Adams puts him in the role that he wants to be, which in Henry Clay's mind is the primary objective, because what does that make him in his mind? Next man up. He's looking at number 7 now. I want to be 7th President of the United States. Unfortunate reality for Henry Clay is that kind of action or deal or lack thereof, whatever you want to call it, if it was really quid pro quo or not, the fact that he accepted that role of Secretary of State basically condemned the entire administration. Adams really didn't do a lot in the 4 years as president. Henry Clay basically had this storm cloud over his head for the rest of his life now because of this action. So rather than the Secretary of State role being the mechanism that would catapult him to be the next president, it was actually the call of war from the Jackson camp, who was so upset when they heard that Henry Clay was going to be Secretary of State. They felt so taken advantage of at the time that they basically had this corrupt bargain, is what Jackson was calling it. He rode this all the way to the election in 1828, where he had a rematch against John Quincy Adams, absolutely destroys him, because the people, after listening to Jackson for 4 years about this corrupt bargain, agreed with him. They're like, whether it was corrupt or not, the fact that Henry Clay ended up Secretary of State was both the undoings of John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay. So that kind of begs the question, if God had intervened in this election, in John Quincy Adams, so that would signify he wanted John Quincy Adams to be president, yet John Quincy Adams has a very uneventful 4 years, gets called out, and loses the next election in the same way that his father lost his second election. It begs the question, why did God want him to be president? If he did actually intervene on the behalf, or if God did intervene through General Van Rennie and that mysterious vote on the ground, what was the purpose? So I think the historical significance to understand is John Quincy Adams, as a contributor to history, his time before and during his presidency, it really is not significant at all. However, the unique thing about John Quincy Adams, he's one of two, so only two former presidents to serve in another elected role after their president. So not only does he get elected to the House after he's president, when his district back home votes for him basically against his will, he holds that position in the House for 17 years. So John Quincy Adams does 4 years as president, and then he goes to the House, and over the course of those 17 years is basically the most hated man in the House. See, you might ask yourself, was he hated because of the whole Henry Clay stuff and the political doings of the election of 1824? No. John Quincy Adams, in this time of these 17 years, he becomes the most outspoken advocate for the abolition of slavery. He is absolutely detested and receives death threats and things from the Southern delegations and the Southern sympathizers throughout the 1830s and 40s. As he's fighting against slavery in D.C., he's arguing in front of the Supreme Court the case of the freeing of the slaves on the Spanish vessel, the Amistad, which is basically a group of slaves on their way into slavery, overthrew their captors and wanted to sail home to Africa. But most importantly, John Quincy Adams is fighting this thing called the gag rule. At the time, in 1830, this was the first time that slavery was becoming more of a topic of discussion. Beforehand, it was kind of just a status quo. But people were starting to wake up, and they were questioning the morality of slavery and whether or not the institution should be continued to be allowed in the southern states, and if the institution should be allowed to spread via the bringing in of new states, such as the annexation of Texas, Missouri, basically just a lot of difficulties at play. Slavery becomes really a hot button issue. And because of that, in the 30s, there's this implementation of this rule in the House called the gag rule, which was in place for 8 years, from 1836 to 1844, which basically meant the House would not talk about slavery at all. So anyone who brought up slavery or brought up a petition, anything involving slavery that was even remotely close to having the institution be cast in a dark light, they would immediately get impeached. Okay? So the gag rule was very serious. It effectively meant that the conversation that people wanted to start having in the 1830s, which was the morality of slavery, was being gagged out by this gag rule. And John Quincy Adams made it his mission to get this gag rule abolished. And in 1844, he actually does that. Important thing to note at the time is less than 20 years later, because of that, because of all the fights in the Senate and the House from there on out, and the actions throughout the country, you have the Civil War starting with the secession of the southern states, and you have eventually the abolishment of slavery. And so it's kind of crazy to think about that John Quincy Adams, his most impactful years were not as he was president. It was as he was in the House of Representatives, playing a key role in the eventual fighting of the Civil War, basically, to stop slavery within the southern states. So the question originally posed is, if God did have a hand in the election of 1824, was that potentially the reason? Would John Quincy Adams have been as strong of a person to be the head of this abolition movement in the House had he not been former president? So was the title that he was carrying basically helping add weight to this whole concept, add legitimacy? Because beforehand, it wasn't really anyone of major prominence. A lot of the founding fathers were slave owners, and so they sided more with the southern states. But John Quincy Adams was not that case. He was this outspoken advocate against it for 17 years. And so would he have succeeded as well had he not spent those 4 years as president and acquired that title? Or was the title the legitimacy that the abolition movement needed in order to gain traction to eventually lead to that Civil War? I'll let you decide. So, cool. Thank you very much for tuning in to episode 1 of American Memoirs. Very excited to continue this and keep sharing interesting stories from my readings. If you have any suggestions or want to share any comments, feel free to shoot me a message on Twitter or wherever. I don't actually know where podcasters talk to their audiences, but I'm sure if there is anyone who listens to this, you can let me know. Thanks, and have a great day.